Something is happening in the spirit and you have felt it. The attacks became heavier, the pressure became violent, and suddenly everything around you started shaking. But what if the enemy is not attacking because you are losing, but because your delay is about to expire? What if hell has already seen the breakthrough that you cannot see yet? And X-Witch once revealed this terrifying truth. The darkest warfare always comes right before God releases what was delayed over your life. And tonight, you are about to understand why the enemy is terrified of your next season. The enemy does not waste warfare on people who are going nowhere. That is the first secret many people never understand. You kept asking yourself why the attacks suddenly intensified, why confusion appeared out of nowhere, why relationships started collapsing, why strange exhaustion entered your life, why fear began whispering to your mind at night. But according to Occult testimonies, there is a terrifying reason behind this pattern. In witchcraft circles, they study spiritual timing, they monitor seasons, they watch transitions. They look for moments when a person is close to a breakthrough, close to restoration, close to divine elevation. Because the enemy knows something many believers forget. Satan cannot stop God's promise permanently. He can only try to delay it long enough for you to surrender before it arrives. That is why the warfare becomes violent near the end of the delay. The enemy panics. When your appointed season approaches, you thought the pressure meant God abandoned you. Number. The pressure increased because hell realized your release date was getting close. This is why many people experience the worst attacks right before something major changes in their lives. Right before the new job appears. Right before healing manifests. Right before the marriage is restored. Right before the ministry opens. Right before the financial breakthrough comes. The enemy launches fear to make you quit too early. And this strategy is ancient. The enemy studies exhaustion. He knows people become vulnerable when delays last too long. After enough waiting, people start doubting. After enough disappointment, people stop praying with fire. After enough pain, people start questioning God. That is exactly the atmosphere the enemy wants, because the final stage of delay is often the most dangerous stage spiritually. Why? Because you are closest to breakthrough while emotionally feeling farthest from it. That contradiction destroys many people. You pray for years, nothing changes. You fast, nothing moves. You obey God, still no visible answer. Then suddenly the warfare intensifies, and many believers misinterpret the moment. They think, maybe God said no, maybe I failed, maybe nothing will ever change. But Kshuichis have confessed that this is often the exact moment dark powers become desperate. Because heaven's answer is approaching. There is something else they reveal that should wake you up immediately. The enemy attacks identity before breakthrough, not just circumstances, identity. He wants you to forget who you are before you step into what God prepared for you. That is why the attacks suddenly become deeply personal. You start hearing thoughts like, you are not chosen, you are weak, you are forgotten, you will never escape this cycle. Those whispers are not random. The enemy is trying to disconnect you from spiritual confidence. Because confidence is dangerous to darkness. A believer who remembers their authority becomes difficult to control. A believer who refuses to surrender becomes a threat to hell. And this is why the enemy creates emotional storms during delayed seasons. Notice the pattern. When your breakthrough gets close, people misunderstand you. Unexpected conflict appears. All temptations return. Mental exhaustion increases. Spiritual dryness attacks you. Sudden discouragement surrounds you. It feels coordinated, because it often is. The enemy wants internal collapse before external victory arrives. Because if he can break your spirit, he can make you walk away from your promise voluntarily. This is why so many people quit one season too early. They leave before restoration comes. They stop praying before the answer manifests. They abandon purpose before the door opens. And later they wonder why the breakthrough never arrived. The enemy understands one terrifying principle. If he cannot destroy destiny, he will attempt to exhaust the person carrying it. Exhaustion has become one of Satan's greatest weapons in this generation. Not always direct destruction, fatigue, constant pressure, continuous disappointment, repeated discouragement. The goal is simple. Wear you down slowly until you no longer resist spiritually. That is why some attacks feel endless. The enemy hopes repetition will weaken your faith. But what many believers do not realize is this. Persistent warfare can also be evidence of persistent purpose. Darkness does not mobilize against emptiness. The enemy reacts to spiritual potential. There are people listening right now who have been under unusual warfare for months. Nothing makes sense anymore. You feel isolated, drained, emotionally bruised, spiritually attacked from every angle. But what if this battle is confirmation that something massive is approaching your life? What if hell sees your next season more clearly than you do? Remember this carefully. In many biblical moments, intense opposition appeared before major deliverance. Right before Israel escaped bondage, Pharaoh increased the pressure. Right before breakthrough, resistance intensified. That pattern still exists. Because the enemy fears what happens after your delay expires. He fears the version of you that survives the waiting season. He fears the authority you will carry after enduring warfare. He fears your testimony. Because survivors become dangerous. People who have walked through darkness and remained faithful carry a different kind of spiritual fire. And hell knows it. That is why the enemy tries to make delayed believers feel abandoned. Isolation is strategic warfare. If the enemy can convince you that you are alone, your strength begins to collapse emotionally. You stop fighting aggressively. You stop expecting miracles. You stop believing breakthrough is possible. But this is the deception. Delay is not denial. Silence is not abandonment. And warfare is not proof of defeat. In many cases, warfare is evidence that the enemy is terrified of what is about to happen next. You need to hear this clearly. The attacks became violent because your expiration date in bondage is approaching. The enemy senses movement in the spirit. Chains are weakening. Doors are preparing to open. Cycles are preparing to break. And darkness is reacting. This is why you cannot interpret warfare emotionally anymore. You must see spiritually. Because if you only look naturally, you will panic. But spiritually, you begin to realize something terrifying to the kingdom of darkness. The enemy attacks hardest when he knows he is running out of time. And that means one possibility becomes impossible to ignore. Your delay may be closer to ending than you think. One of the most terrifying revelations ex-witches have confessed is this. The enemy becomes most aggressive when he can no longer legally hold a person in spiritual captivity. That statement alone should shake you, because many believers think the warfare increases because Satan is becoming stronger. Number. The warfare increases because his grip is weakening. There comes a moment in the spirit when cycles are about to break, when prayers stored for years begin moving heaven, when obedience begins unlocking delayed doors, when God decides the waiting season has reached its limit. And according to former occult insiders, darkness reacts violently during that moment. Why? Because Satan knows something is expiring. Your delay, your captivity, your season of limitation. That is why attacks suddenly become irrational. Have you noticed it? Problems begin appearing all at once. Unexpected bills arrive. Emotional heaviness increases. People turn against you suddenly. Opportunities collapse without explanation. Fear attacks your sleep. Confusion attacks your mind. It feels like hell launched a coordinated assault against your life. Sometimes because it did. The enemy understands timing. And one of his final strategies before breakthrough is overwhelming pressure. He wants you emotionally overloaded, because overloaded people stop discerning spiritually. The enemy knows that if he can flood your mind with enough fear, you may miss the fact that breakthrough is standing at the door. This is why many people break down right before deliverance, not because God failed them, because the pressure reached its highest point before the chain snapped. Ex-witches have described how dark kingdoms specifically target exhausted believers, not weak believers. Exhausted believers, there is a difference. A tired believer begins questioning everything. Prayer becomes harder. Hope becomes fragile. Discernment becomes cloudy. And suddenly dangerous thoughts start entering the mind. Maybe this pain will never end. Maybe God forgot me. Maybe I should just give up. That is not coincidence. That is warfare against endurance. Because endurance threatens the kingdom of darkness. The enemy fears believers who refuse to quit during delayed seasons. Why? Because persistence eventually breaks resistance. And Satan knows it. This is why the enemy fights your consistency more than your emotions. He knows feelings change daily. But consistent prayer, consistent obedience, consistent faith during delay, that becomes spiritually dangerous. Many people do not understand why they face strange resistance every time they try to move closer to God. Suddenly distractions appear, fatigue increases, temptation intensifies, unexpected chaos erupts. The enemy is trying to interrupt spiritual momentum, because momentum matters in warfare. A believer moving consistently toward God becomes harder to delay, and hell reacts to movement. This is why some of your hardest battles began after you started praying more seriously. The enemy noticed movement, he noticed spiritual growth, he noticed increasing authority, he noticed that your mindset was changing, and that terrified darkness. There is another hidden truth Occult insiders revealed. Sometimes the enemy attacks relationships before breakthrough because isolation weakens spiritual endurance. Think about it carefully. Right before major breakthroughs, many people experience betrayal, friends disappear, support fades, misunderstandings increase, unexpected division enters families. Why? Because isolation creates vulnerability. The enemy wants you emotionally disconnected while you are spiritually transitioning, because transitions are sensitive seasons, and if he cannot stop your destiny directly, he will try to surround you with discouragement until you sabotage yourself. That is why some people begin self-destructing during delayed seasons, not because they are evil, because prolonged warfare distorted their thinking. Pain changes perspective if you do not guard your spirit. This is why the enemy attacks the mind so aggressively near the end of delay. Mental warfare becomes intense. Suddenly you overthink everything, feel emotionally unstable. You lose peace without explanation. Fear keeps replaying worst-case scenarios. The enemy wants mental surrender before physical breakthrough arrives, because defeated thinking creates passive faith, and passive faith rarely fights back. But this is exactly where many believers miss the greatest spiritual opportunity. The final stage before breakthrough often requires the strongest faith, not emotional faith, determined faith, faith that stands when nothing makes sense, faith that keeps praying while bleeding emotionally, faith that refuses to surrender even when heaven feels silent. That kind of faith terrifies darkness, because Satan understands something many believers forget. If you survive the final stage of delay, you often enter a level of authority you never carried before. Delayed seasons produce spiritual maturity. The pain teaches discernment. The waiting teaches endurance. The warfare teaches dependency on God. And when the delay expires, the person who emerges is no longer spiritually fragile. That is what the enemy fears. He fears who you are becoming through survival. You thought the battle was only about receiving a blessing. Sometimes the battle is about transformation. Because God is not only preparing the blessing, He is preparing the person who will carry it. And preparation periods are painful, especially when heaven feels quiet. That silence confuses many believers. They assume silence means inactivity, but silence often means preparation is happening beyond your visibility. The enemy knows this. That is why he attacks impatient people aggressively, because impatience can destroy what warfare could not. Some people leave their assignment too early. Some abandon prayer too early. Some compromise spiritually too early. And the enemy celebrates because delay accomplished what direct attack failed to accomplish. But you must understand something critical. The closer you get to breakthrough, the more important your reactions become. Your attitude matters. Your focus matters. Your words matter. Because the enemy listens carefully during delayed seasons. He watches for agreement with defeat. Every time you declare hopelessness, fear grows stronger. Every time you surrender mentally, resistance increases. But every time you stand spiritually despite pain, darkness weakens. That is why worship becomes warfare. That is why prayer becomes resistance. That is why faith becomes a weapon. You are not just surviving emotionally, you are fighting spiritually. And according to many former occult testimonies, persistent believers become extremely difficult targets for dark kingdoms. Why? Because endurance disrupts satanic expectations. The enemy expects you to collapse eventually. He expects bitterness. He expects compromise. He expects surrender. But when you continue standing despite exhaustion, something shifts in the spirit. Hell realizes the delay did not destroy you. And that changes everything. Because now the enemy faces a terrifying possibility. What if the pressure failed? What if the delay strengthened you instead of breaking you? What if the warfare accidentally created a stronger believer? That possibility terrifies darkness. And that is exactly why the attacks intensify before the delay expires. The enemy is desperately trying to stop what he already senses is coming. There is a moment in spiritual warfare that switches fear deeply. A moment when the person they targeted refuses to break. Not because the attack stopped, not because life suddenly became easy, but because something inside that person awakens, a dangerous realization. The realization that the warfare was never proof of weakness, it was proof of significance. This is where everything changes. Because once you stop interpreting attacks emotionally and start discerning spiritually, the enemy begins losing psychological control over you. And psychological control is one of darkness's greatest weapons. The enemy wants your interpretation more than your pain. He knows pain alone cannot destroy you. But if he controls how you interpret the pain, he can influence your response. That is why delayed seasons often come with confusion. The enemy whispers, "You are cursed, you are forgotten, nothing will change. This battle will never end." He wants you to misread the season. Because if you misread the season, you may abandon your position before breakthrough arrives. This is exactly what happened to many people in scripture. They reached the edge of breakthrough, then fear convinced them to retreat. And the enemy still uses the same strategy today. Fear before transition, pressure before elevation, chaos before release. Exoccult insiders have revealed that dark kingdoms study emotional patterns carefully. They watch for discouragement. They watch for isolation. They watch for moments of exhaustion. Why? Because exhausted people often make permanent decisions based on temporary pain. That is why the enemy increases emotional warfare near the end of delayed seasons. He knows breakthrough creates dangerous believers. Think about the person who survives years of warfare and still trusts God. That person becomes difficult to intimidate. Once someone has survived darkness, betrayal, delay, fear, confusion, and spiritual attacks, they stop being easily shaken. That is the kind of believer hell fears. Not the loudest believer, the tested believer. The believer who learned endurance in hidden battles. Because hidden battles create spiritual depth. There are people listening right now who feel emotionally worn down. You smile publicly while secretly fighting invisible battles. You pray while carrying exhaustion nobody understands. You worship while your heart feels bruised. And sometimes you wonder, why is this happening to me? But ex-witches have repeatedly confessed something terrifying. The enemy often targets people carrying future influence, not because of who they are now, because of who they are becoming. Darkness attacks potential early. The enemy tries to suffocate purpose before it fully develops. That is why some people experience warfare even from childhood. Constant rejection, strange oppression, repeated cycles of pain, unusual resistance everywhere they go. The enemy noticed something about their future before they did, and he attempted to create enough damage early to stop destiny later. But here is the terrifying truth hell hates. Survival itself becomes part of your power. Every battle you survive builds something inside you. The pain taught discernment. The betrayal taught wisdom. The delay taught endurance. The warfare taught dependence on God. And now you are not the same person you used to be. That transformation threatens darkness. Because the enemy preferred the old version of you, the distracted version, the spiritually asleep version, the passive version. But warfare woke you up. Pain forced you into prayer. Delay pushed you toward God. Brokenness created spiritual hunger. And now hell is facing a version of you that became stronger through suffering. That was never the enemy's plan. He wanted destruction. But God used the warfare for development. This is why many believers become spiritually stronger after surviving their hardest seasons. The attack that was supposed to destroy them actually trained them. And suddenly they begin discerning things they ignored before. They recognize manipulation faster. They guard their peace more carefully. They pray differently. They depend on God more deeply. That maturity becomes dangerous to darkness, because spiritually mature believers are harder to deceive. And deception is one of Satan's primary weapons. The enemy prefers blind believers, distracted believers, emotionally controlled believers. But once discernment increases, the enemy loses one of his greatest advantages. That is why some attacks are specifically designed to keep you emotionally unstable. Constant anxiety, constant distraction, constant discouragement. The enemy hopes emotional noise will block spiritual clarity, because clarity creates resistance. A believer who sees clearly becomes harder to manipulate. This is why the enemy attacks your focus during delayed seasons. Have you noticed how difficult it becomes to concentrate spiritually when warfare intensifies? Prayer suddenly feels interrupted. Your mind wanders constantly. Negative thoughts become louder. Distractions multiply. This is strategic. The enemy fears focused believers because focused believers become spiritually aggressive. And aggressive faith disrupts darkness. There is another reason the enemy attacks violently before delay expires. He fears multiplication because breakthrough rarely affects only one person. When God transforms your life, other people get impacted too. Your healing encourages others. Your testimony strengthens others. Your freedom inspires others. The enemy knows breakthrough spreads. That is why he fights certain people intensely. He understands that if they break free, they may help others escape too. And darkness hates chain reactions of freedom. That is why some of your battles felt larger than you. Because the enemy was not only fighting your present, he was fighting your future influence. He was fighting the people connected to your assignment. He was fighting the impact your testimony would eventually carry. But here is the revelation that changes everything. The very fact that the enemy attacked you this intensely may reveal how valuable your future really is. Darkness does not overreact without reason. The warfare revealed importance. The resistance revealed significance. The pressure revealed potential. And now the enemy is terrified because despite everything, you are still standing. You cried, but you survived. You struggled, but you survived. You felt overwhelmed, but you survived. And survival frustrated hell because the enemy expected surrender by now. He expected silence. He expected compromise. He expected spiritual collapse. But instead, you are still praying, still believing, still fighting, still standing. That endurance changes the atmosphere spiritually. Because every battle you survive weakens fear's authority over your life. And eventually a terrifying moment arrives for the kingdom of darkness. The moment you stop fearing the warfare. The moment you realize the attacks were evidence that your breakthrough was getting closer. The moment you understand the enemy was reacting to what heaven was preparing. And once that realization fully enters your spirit, the warfare stops intimidating you. There is one final truth which is revealed that terrifies the kingdom of darkness more than almost anything else. The enemy knows delays have expiration dates. Read that again carefully. Delays are temporary. The enemy fights desperately because he understands something many believers forget during painful seasons. There is a limit to how long darkness can resist what God has already spoken. That is why warfare becomes chaotic near the end, not organized. Chaotic, because panic begins entering the enemy's camp. The attacks intensify because darkness senses loss approaching. You thought the pressure meant defeat. Number. Sometimes pressure is evidence that the enemy knows his time around your life is running out. This explains why many believers experience sudden escalations before breakthrough. Everything hits at once. Financial pressure, emotional pressure, mental exhaustion, unexpected conflict, spiritual heaviness. It feels unbearable, and that is intentional. The enemy wants your focus on the storm instead of the expiration date attached to it. Because if you recognize the season correctly, you may stop fearing the war completely. And fear is one of the enemy's greatest tools. Fear distorts perception. Fear magnifies problems. Fear weakens discernment. Fear drains spiritual authority. That is why hell works aggressively to keep believers emotionally overwhelmed. But former occult insiders have confessed something shocking. Dark powers become frustrated when believers continue trusting God during severe warfare. Why? Because fearless faith disrupts demonic intimidation. The enemy relies heavily on emotional reactions, panic, hopelessness, discouragement. But when believers remain spiritually steady despite pressure, darkness begins losing influence. This is why calm, faith becomes warfare, not passive faith, steady faith. Faith that refuses to collapse emotionally. The enemy expected the delay to destroy you emotionally. He expected bitterness. He expected anger toward God. He expected spiritual exhaustion to silence your prayer life. But somehow you kept surviving. And survival confused darkness. Because the enemy calculated your breaking point. He thought the betrayal would destroy you. He thought the rejection would silence you. He thought the waiting season would make you quit. But you are still here, still breathing, still praying, still resisting. That persistence carries spiritual power. Because every day you refuse to surrender weaken the assignment against your life. Many people think victory appears suddenly. But spiritual victories are often built through consistent resistance during hidden battles. Every prayer mattered. Every act of obedience mattered. Every moment you chose faith over despair mattered. Even when you saw nothing changing, especially then. The enemy wanted visible delay to produce invisible surrender. But heaven was strengthening you secretly. There is another reason the enemy attacks violently before delays expire. He fears restored authority. Many believers lose confidence during long warfare seasons. After enough disappointment, they begin shrinking spiritually. Prayer becomes quieter. Faith becomes weaker. Expectation disappears. That loss of confidence benefits darkness. Because spiritually insecure, believers rarely use their authority boldly. But once breakthrough begins approaching, something starts awakening again. Hope returns, discernment sharpens, spiritual hunger increases. And the enemy notices immediately. because restored confidence threatens demonic oppression. The enemy fears believers who know who they are spiritually, believers who stop begging fearfully and start praying with authority, believers who stop agreeing with defeat, believers who recognize that delay never cancelled destiny. This is why some attacks become extremely personal near the end of delayed seasons. The enemy wants emotional wounds deep enough to silence your confidence permanently. But there is something darkness never fully understands. God often uses the very season meant to break you to build unshakable authority inside you. The delay developed endurance, the warfare developed discernment, the suffering developed spiritual depth, and now the version of you emerging from this season carries greater strength than before. That is what hell fears most, not your past self, your transformed self. The version of you that learned how to survive storms, the version of you that discovered intimacy with God in hidden pain, the version of you that no longer depends on emotions to stay faithful. That believer becomes dangerous to darkness, because mature faith cannot be manipulated easily. Ex-witches have confessed that many attacks are designed to provoke emotional reactions that open doors, spiritually. Anger, bitterness, unforgiveness. The enemy hopes prolonged pain will eventually corrupt your heart. Because if the delay changes your spirit negatively, darkness gains influence. That is why protecting your heart during warfare is critical. Not just surviving externally, guarding internally, refusing bitterness, refusing hatred, refusing agreement with despair. Because the enemy's greatest goal was never just delaying your breakthrough, it was transforming you into someone spiritually defeated before the breakthrough arrived. But the fact that you are still listening right now means something important. The process did not finish you. The warfare failed to erase your destiny, and now heaven is preparing movement. You may not see it yet, but shifts are happening spiritually. Some doors are already weakening. Some chains are already breaking. Some delays are already expiring. The enemy senses it. That is why the attacks became irrational recently. Darkness reacts when transition approaches, and your transition may be closer than you realize. This is the moment many believers must make a decision. Will you interpret the warfare as proof that God abandoned you? Or will you recognize the possibility that hell attacked violently because something powerful is approaching your life? Because once you understand this truth, fear begins losing power over you. You stop panicking during resistance. You stop assuming delay means denial. You stop interpreting attacks as permanent defeat. Instead, you begin seeing warfare differently. You realize the enemy may have overplayed his hand, because the intensity of the battle exposed the importance of your future. And now the kingdom of darkness is facing a terrifying outcome. After all the attacks, after all the delays, after all the pressure, you are still standing. And if you are still standing, then the enemy may already be losing. The warfare was never proof that you were forgotten. It was proof that something in your future terrified the kingdom of darkness. The delay did not destroy you, it trained you. The attacks did not erase your calling, they revealed how valuable it truly is. Now the enemy is watching a believer who survived the pressure, survived the waiting, and refused to surrender. And that changes everything in the spirit. Because when your delay finally expires, you will not emerge weak, you will emerge with fire, authority, and victory.